On the afternoon of November 19th, 1984, Barbara Joy Crowley Walker sat in her small apartment in West Dennis, Massachusetts, staring at a telephone. She was 47 years old, an alcoholic who worked sporadically as a real estate agent, and she was about to make a decision that would expose one of the most damaging espionage operations in American history. Barbara had known since 1968 that her ex-husband, John Anthony Walker, Jr., was spying for the Soviet Union. She had kept that secret for 16 years while her marriage deteriorated, her drinking escalated, and her former husband continued to compromise U.S. Navy communications security. Now, in November 1984, mounting evidence and suspicion that John had recruited their son Michael into his spy ring had pushed Barbara to a crisis point she could no longer avoid. At approximately 4:30 p.m. that afternoon, Barbara picked up the telephone and called the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Boston field office. According to FBI records, her words were slurred from the vodka she had been drinking throughout the day as she told the receptionist she had information about espionage. The call was transferred to Special Agent Walter Price, 39 years old, who had been with the FBI for 12 years and had been assigned to the Boston field office's counterintelligence squad for 6 years. Price listened as Barbara explained, in a rambling and sometimes confused narrative, that her ex-husband had been spying for the Soviet Union for more than 15 years, that she had known about it for much of that time, and that she believed he had now recruited their son. Price had handled numerous calls from people claiming to have information about espionage, and the vast majority turned out to be from individuals who were mentally unstable, who had misunderstood innocent situations, or who had personal vendettas. Barbara Walker's call contained several elements that might have marked it as non-credible. She was obviously intoxicated, her story involved events allegedly dating back many years, and she admitted to having kept the information secret for an extended period. However, the call also contained specific details: names, dates, Navy positions, locations that suggested at least the possibility of legitimacy. Price arranged to meet with Barbara in person the following day. Before we continue with how Barbara's long-delayed phone call would unravel the most damaging spy ring in U.S. Navy history, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. We bring you the documented truth behind Cold War espionage cases like this every week, uncovering the human cost and moral complexity behind these operations that shaped history. Now, let's trace how the FBI's investigation began and ultimately exposed a network that had been compromising American naval security for nearly 2 decades. The meeting between Barbara Walker and FBI agents occurred on November 20th, 1984, at approximately 2 p.m. at a coffee shop in Hyannis, Massachusetts, approximately 20 miles from Barbara's apartment. Price was accompanied by Special Agent Beverly Andress, 34 years old, who had been assigned to assist with the interview. Both agents had been instructed by their supervisor to approach the interview with professional skepticism, but to document everything Barbara said and to collect any physical evidence she might provide. Barbara arrived at the meeting approximately 15 minutes late, appearing disheveled and nervous. According to the agent's reports, she ordered coffee but did not drink much of it, instead holding the cup with both hands as if trying to warm herself, despite the mild temperature. For approximately 2 hours, Barbara provided the agents with a detailed account of her ex-husband's espionage activities as she understood them, her discovery of evidence in 1968, and her decision to remain silent for 16 years. The story Barbara told the agents began in 1968, when she and John were living in Navy housing at Naval Station, Norfolk, Virginia. According to Barbara's testimony, she had discovered evidence of John's espionage during a move from one housing unit to another. While packing boxes, according to her later recollection, she had found hidden in the back of a closet behind old uniforms a manila envelope containing documents that appeared to be official Navy communications and photographs of what looked like classified technical manuals. She had also found approximately $2,000 in cash, an amount that seemed impossibly large for a Navy enlisted man whose salary was modest and whose financial situation was perpetually precarious. When Barbara had confronted John about the documents and money, he had initially claimed it was related to a private business venture. But Barbara had pressed him, and eventually, during a conversation that lasted most of the night, John had admitted that he was passing classified information to the Soviet Union. According to Barbara's recollection of that 1968 conversation, John had explained that he was being paid substantial sums of money, that the information he was providing was helping to maintain strategic balance and prevent war, and that he had taken extensive precautions to avoid detection. Barbara told the FBI agents that her response to this revelation had been complicated by fear, financial dependence, concern for their 4 children, and uncertainty about what course of action would serve anyone's best interests. John had told her that if she reported him, he would go to prison, she would lose her home and income, their children would be left without a father, and would suffer the stigma of having a traitor in the family, and nothing good would come of it. According to Barbara's testimony, he had also told her, in a tone that seemed partly threatening and partly pleading, that if she kept his secret, he would take care of the family and ensure they never wanted for anything. Barbara had made the decision to remain silent. She told the agents she had rationalized this decision by telling herself she was protecting her children, that she had no real proof that could convince authorities, and that the situation was too complex for her to navigate. But she acknowledged that the real reason was fear. Fear of her husband, fear of poverty, fear of judgment, fear of the unknown consequences that would follow if she disrupted their lives. For the next 10 years, from 1968 to 1978, Barbara had lived with the knowledge of her husband's espionage while trying to maintain the appearance of normal family life. The knowledge had corroded her from the inside. Barbara had always been a social drinker, but during these years her drinking had escalated from recreational to problematic to dependent. She had used alcohol to numb the anxiety, the guilt, the sense of being trapped in a situation she could not escape. Her relationship with John had deteriorated, though the deterioration had as much to do with his personality, his arrogance, his self-centeredness, his need for control, as with the secret she was keeping for him. In 1976, John had retired from the Navy after 20 years of service. He had reached the rank of Chief Warrant Officer and had worked primarily in communications with security clearances that gave him access to highly classified materials related to Navy cryptographic systems. After retirement, he had started a private detective agency in Norfolk called Confidential Reports, though Barbara suspected this was primarily a cover for continued espionage activities. In 1978, after Barbara's drinking had progressed to the point where she was non-functional for significant portions of each day, and their relationship had become hostile and sometimes physically abusive, they divorced. Now, 6 years after the divorce, Barbara told the FBI agents that she had become convinced John had recruited their son Michael into his espionage operation. Michael, 23 years old, was serving in the Navy aboard the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, working in communications just as his father had. Barbara had observed interactions between father and son that aroused her suspicions, though she provided no specific evidence. Nevertheless, the realization that her 16 years of silence, which she had rationalized as protecting her children, might instead have enabled John to recruit Michael had pushed her to finally make the phone call she should have made in 1968. The FBI's investigation of John Anthony Walker, Jr. began immediately after the November 20th interview with Barbara. The Bureau's first step was to verify the basic facts of Barbara's account. Records confirmed that John Walker, 47 years old, had indeed served in the Navy from 1955 to 1976, had held positions in communications with access to highly classified materials, and had retired as a chief warrant officer. He had started a business called Confidential Reports in Norfolk after his retirement, though the business appeared to be minimally active and generated little obvious income. His son Michael was currently serving in the Navy, assigned to the USS Nimitz in communications. His other children, Laura, Cynthia, and Margaret, lived in Massachusetts and Maryland. With basic facts verified, the FBI initiated a more detailed investigation. This investigation, given the codename Windfall, would eventually involve dozens of agents working across multiple states. The FBI chose surveillance rather than direct confrontation. The reasoning was that if Barbara's allegations were true, John Walker had been engaged in espionage for many years and had apparently been successful at avoiding detection, which suggested he was sophisticated and careful. A direct confrontation might cause him to destroy evidence, might fail to produce a confession, and might not reveal the full extent of his network. Surveillance, if successful, could document his activities, identify his Soviet contacts, reveal other members of his operation, and provide clear evidence for prosecution. The surveillance of John Walker began on December 4, 1984. FBI agents established observation posts near his residence, a small apartment in Norfolk, and near his business office. Walker lived alone, having been divorced from Barbara and having no current serious relationship. According to surveillance logs, his daily routine was relatively unremarkable. He typically left his apartment in the morning, drove to his office, spent several hours there with apparently few clients or visitors, ran errands, and returned to his apartment in the evening. For the first 3 weeks of surveillance, Walker's activities appeared entirely mundane. He went to the grocery store, the bank, the post office. He ate lunch at various restaurants, usually alone. He visited a gym several times per week. He went to bars in the evening, where he drank and occasionally spoke with other patrons, but did not appear to have close friends. Nothing about his behavior suggested involvement in espionage, and FBI agents began to wonder whether Barbara's allegations might have been the product of an angry ex-wife's imagination combined with alcohol-fueled paranoia. Then, on December 27, 1984, Walker's behavior changed. According to FBI surveillance reports, at approximately 7:15 p.m., he left his apartment carrying a small duffel bag and driving his van, a brown Chevrolet Astro. Instead of following his usual routes, he drove west out of Norfolk on Interstate 64, heading toward Richmond. FBI surveillance vehicles followed at varying distances, coordinating their movements to avoid detection. Walker continued west past Richmond, then north on Interstate 64 toward Washington. At approximately 10:30 p.m., he exited at Rockville, Maryland. He drove through suburban streets for approximately 20 minutes, making turns that appeared designed to detect surveillance, before eventually driving into a park area in Montgomery County, Maryland. The location was closed to visitors after dark, but the gates were not locked. Walker drove slowly along a park road, then pulled into a small parking area near a trailhead. He turned off his vehicle's lights and engine and sat in the van for approximately 5 minutes. FBI agents, positioned at distances of several hundred yards, watched through night vision equipment. At approximately 11:08 p.m., according to surveillance logs, Walker exited his van, walked to the back, opened the rear doors, and removed what appeared to be a bag or package. He then walked from the parking area onto a trail that led into the woods. Two FBI agents on foot surveillance, equipped with night vision equipment and moving carefully to avoid making noise that might alert Walker, followed at a distance. Walker walked along the trail for approximately 10 minutes, occasionally pausing as if listening for any sound of pursuit. Then he stopped at a location where a large rock outcropping was visible from the trail. According to the surveillance report, Walker spent approximately 2 minutes at this location, moving around the rock formation as if looking for something specific. He then appeared to place the bag or package he had been carrying in a concealed location among the rocks. After placing the package, Walker returned to his van using the same trail. He drove out of the park and began driving back toward Norfolk, arriving at his apartment at approximately 2:15 a.m. on December 28th. The FBI agents who had followed Walker faced a critical decision. Should they retrieve the package immediately to determine what Walker had left, or should they leave the package in place to see if anyone came to collect it? The decision was made to leave the package and maintain surveillance on the location. If the package was part of a dead drop operation, a technique where information or materials are left at a prearranged location to be collected later by another party, avoiding direct contact, a Soviet intelligence officer would likely come to retrieve it, and the FBI could document that collection. Surveillance of the location continued throughout December 28th and into December 29th. Multiple FBI agents rotated through observation posts positioned to watch the rock formation where Walker had placed the package. On the evening of December 29th, at approximately 8:45 p.m., a vehicle entered the park, a vehicle that surveillance agents identified as a Soviet diplomatic vehicle from the embassy in Washington. According to FBI records, the vehicle was driven by a Soviet diplomat who would later be identified as having cover status as a consular official, but who was suspected of being a KGB intelligence officer. The Soviet diplomat drove to the same parking area where Walker had parked 2 nights earlier. He exited the vehicle and walked along the same trail Walker had used. FBI agents documented his movement using night vision equipment and long-range cameras. The diplomat reached the rock formation where Walker had left the package. He spent several minutes searching the area, then appeared to retrieve something, presumably the package Walker had left. He returned to his vehicle carrying what appeared to be a bag, then drove out of the park and returned to the Soviet embassy in Washington. The FBI did not stop or search the diplomat, as doing so would have violated diplomatic protocols and would have compromised the ongoing investigation. However, the surveillance had now documented a complete dead drop operation. Walker placing material at a prearranged location and a Soviet intelligence officer retrieving that material 2 days later. The FBI's investigation intensified significantly following this surveillance. The evidence now clearly supported Barbara Walker's allegations. John Walker was engaged in active espionage, was using sophisticated tradecraft, including dead drops at remote locations, and was in operational contact with Soviet intelligence officers. The next phase of the investigation focused on understanding the full scope of Walker's operation, including whether his son, Michael, was indeed involved as Barbara had suspected. The FBI obtained authorization for electronic surveillance of Walker's apartment and his business office. Agents also began investigating Michael Walker, who was serving in the Navy aboard the USS Nimitz. Surveillance of Michael Walker began in early January 1985. Michael, 23 years old, had enlisted in the Navy in 1982 and had followed a career path similar to his father's, working in communications. According to Navy records, Michael held a security clearance that gave him access to classified communications materials. FBI agents, monitoring John Walker's telephone conversations through court-authorized wiretaps, recorded several calls between John and Michael during January 1985. According to FBI reports, the conversations were ostensibly about routine family matters, but they contained references that agents believed might be coded communications related to espionage activities. The FBI also conducted surveillance of Michael's activities when he was not aboard the Nimitz. Surveillance logs documented several visits Michael made to his father's apartment in Norfolk during periods of leave, and agents observed that these visits appeared to involve the transfer of materials between father and son, though the specific nature of the materials could not be determined through visual surveillance alone. During the early months of 1985, FBI surveillance documented additional instances of John Walker conducting what appeared to be dead drop operations in the Washington area. The pattern that emerged was consistent with a sophisticated espionage operation. Walker would travel from Norfolk to the Washington region, would conduct counter-surveillance measures to detect anyone following him, would leave packages at prearranged locations, and Soviet diplomatic personnel would later retrieve those packages. The materials Walker was leaving at these dead drops were presumed to be classified information obtained through his son Michael, who had access to sensitive communications materials aboard the USS Nimitz. The FBI faced a difficult decision about when to make arrests. The longer the investigation continued, the more evidence could be gathered and the better the FBI could understand the full extent of the operation. However, every day that passed meant additional classified information was potentially being compromised. After consultation with Department of Justice prosecutors and Navy intelligence officials, the decision was made to continue surveillance through one more operational cycle while preparing for coordinated arrests. On May 19, 1985, John Walker left Norfolk and drove north, ostensibly on a business trip. FBI surveillance teams followed. Walker drove through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, stopping at several locations. Late that evening, according to FBI reports, he stopped at a remote location near Elkton, Maryland, not far from the Pennsylvania border. Walker exited his van carrying a plastic garbage bag. He walked approximately 40 yards from the road into a wooded area and placed the garbage bag in a concealed location. He then returned to his van and drove a short distance to a motel, where he checked into a room. FBI agents maintained surveillance of both Walker at the motel and the location where he had left the package. In the early morning hours of May 20, 1985, a vehicle approached the location where Walker had left the package. Before the driver could retrieve the package, FBI agents moved in and executed their arrest plan. John Anthony Walker, Jr. was arrested at the motel at approximately 3:30 a.m. on May 20, 1985. According to FBI reports, Walker was in his room when agents knocked on the door, identified themselves, and informed him he was under arrest for espionage. Walker did not resist arrest and did not speak initially. As agents placed him in handcuffs, he was informed of his constitutional rights. Walker stated that he wanted to speak to an attorney. Simultaneously with Walker's arrest, FBI agents at the dead drop location arrested the Soviet diplomat who had arrived to collect the material. The diplomat immediately asserted diplomatic immunity and refused to answer questions. He was transported to FBI headquarters in Washington, where the State Department was notified. The decision was made to declare him persona non grata and to arrange for his immediate expulsion from the United States. At Naval Station Norfolk, FBI agents and Naval Investigative Service agents arrested Michael Walker aboard the USS Nimitz at approximately 6 a.m. on May 20th. According to reports, Michael was taken into custody without incident and was transported to FBI facilities for questioning. The package John Walker had left at the dead drop location was retrieved by FBI agents and examined. According to court documents, it contained a plastic trash bag, inside of which was a second plastic bag containing approximately 129 classified documents. The documents included top-secret cryptographic key lists, technical manuals for communications equipment, and other materials that would allow Soviet intelligence to decrypt U.S. Navy communications. Cryptographic key lists are essential components of encryption systems. They contain the codes and cipher sequences that allow encrypted messages to be converted back into readable text. With these key lists, Soviet intelligence could decrypt enormous volumes of U.S. Navy communications, gaining access to operational orders, ship movements, strategic planning, and virtually every other aspect of naval operations. Also in the package were instructions for the next scheduled dead drop, including date, location, and recognition signals. In John Walker's van, FBI agents found additional evidence including a camera designed for photographing documents, several rolls of film, $10,000 in cash, and notes containing what appeared to be instructions from his Soviet handlers. In his motel room, agents found a briefcase containing more documents related to his espionage activities. John Walker was transported to FBI headquarters in Baltimore, where he was held pending arraignment. On May 21, 1985, he was formally charged with espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, and unauthorized communication of national defense information to a foreign government. The charges carried potential sentences of up to life imprisonment. Michael Walker was charged with the same offenses. The FBI investigation continued even after the arrests, focusing on determining the full extent of the spy ring and identifying any other members. Investigators conducted extensive interviews and analysis of materials seized from Walker. The investigation revealed two additional members of the spy ring: Arthur James Walker, John's brother, and Jerry Alfred Whitworth, a Navy colleague. Arthur Walker, 51 years old, was a retired Navy lieutenant commander who had worked in naval aviation. According to evidence developed by FBI investigators and later court testimony, John had recruited Arthur into the espionage operation sometime around 1980. Arthur had provided his brother with classified documents related to naval aviation and ship movements, receiving relatively modest payments in return. Arthur Walker was arrested on May 28, 1985, at his home in Virginia Beach, Virginia. He initially denied any involvement in espionage, but when presented with evidence including documents found in John's possession that had been traceable to Arthur's access, he admitted his role. He was charged with espionage-related offenses. The arrest of Jerry Alfred Whitworth represented the most significant expansion of the FBI's understanding of the Walker spy ring. Whitworth, 46 years old, was a senior chief petty officer in the Navy, specializing in communications. He had served in the Navy since 1956 and had held numerous positions with access to highly classified cryptographic materials. According to evidence developed by FBI investigators, John Walker had recruited Whitworth into the espionage operation in 1975, and Whitworth had provided Walker with a massive quantity of classified materials over approximately 10 years. The FBI had not initially been aware of Whitworth's involvement, but during post-arrest interrogations, John Walker, faced with overwhelming evidence and seeking to negotiate a more favorable outcome, had identified Whitworth as a member of the operation. Walker provided investigators with detailed information about Whitworth's role, including the types of materials Whitworth had provided, the payments he had received, and the methods used to pass materials between them. Whitworth was arrested on June 3, 1985, in Sacramento, California, where he was living after having retired from active duty several months earlier. At the time of his arrest, Whitworth was working as a locksmith. FBI agents executing a search warrant at his residence found evidence including copies of classified materials, cryptographic key lists, and approximately $12,000 in cash that had been hidden in various locations throughout the house. Whitworth was charged with espionage, conspiracy, and multiple counts of unauthorized disclosure of classified information. John Anthony Walker Jr.'s legal proceedings moved relatively quickly because Walker agreed to plead guilty in exchange for a plea agreement. According to court records, the terms of the agreement were that Walker would provide complete cooperation with investigators, would testify against other members of the spy ring if required, and in exchange, prosecutors would recommend a sentence of life imprisonment rather than seeking the death penalty, which was theoretically available under espionage statutes. Additionally, the agreement specified that if Walker cooperated fully, prosecutors would recommend that his son Michael receive a sentence of no more than 25 years. This aspect of the plea agreement, the reduced sentence for Michael in exchange for John's cooperation, revealed something significant about John Walker's motivations. Despite having recruited his son into espionage and having endangered Michael's life and freedom for his own benefit, John Walker was deeply concerned about the consequences his son would face. According to accounts of the plea negotiations, Walker had insisted that any agreement include provisions protecting Michael from a life sentence. FBI negotiators and prosecutors had agreed, understanding that Walker's cooperation would be valuable in prosecuting Whitworth and in completing the damage assessment. John Walker was formally sentenced on November 6, 1985, in U.S. District Court in Baltimore. He received a life sentence with no possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, prosecutors presented evidence of the scope of Walker's espionage, which had begun in either late 1967 or early 1968 and had continued until his arrest in May 1985, a span of approximately 17 to 18 years. According to evidence presented at sentencing and during subsequent investigations, Walker's initial approach to Soviet intelligence had occurred while he was stationed in Norfolk in the late 1960s. Walker, facing financial difficulties due to gambling debts and poor business decisions, had recognized that his position in Navy communications gave him access to materials that would be extremely valuable to foreign intelligence services. In late 1967, according to his later testimony, he had walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and had offered to provide classified materials in exchange for payment. This method of recruitment, self-volunteering by a potential asset rather than being recruited by an intelligence officer, was relatively unusual but not unprecedented. Walker had understood the value of what he was offering and had negotiated payment terms with his Soviet handlers. Over the years, according to FBI assessments, he had received approximately $1 million in cash payments from Soviet intelligence, though much of this money had been spent on his lifestyle, failed business ventures, and payments to other members of his spy ring. Walker had recruited his brother Arthur sometime around 1980, motivated partly by the need to maintain the flow of classified information after his own retirement from active duty, and partly by family loyalty. According to Arthur's later testimony, he had been reluctant initially, but had agreed after John had convinced him that the espionage was not truly harming national security and that the money would benefit the family. Walker had recruited his son Michael in 1982, shortly after Michael had enlisted in the Navy and had begun working in communications. According to Michael's later testimony, his father had presented the espionage as an opportunity to make extra money, had minimized the risks, and had emphasized that they would be working together. Michael, young and influenced by his father's confidence and authority, had agreed. The recruitment of Jerry Whitworth had occurred in 1975 when both men were stationed at the same facility. According to court testimony, Walker and Whitworth had known each other professionally, and Walker had approached Whitworth with a proposal to provide classified materials in exchange for payment. Whitworth had agreed, motivated primarily by money, but also apparently by a sense of adventure and importance. Over 10 years, Whitworth had provided massive quantities of cryptographic materials to Walker, receiving approximately $332,000 in payments. Michael Walker was sentenced on February 12, 1986, receiving 25 years in federal prison as specified in his father's plea agreement. During his sentencing hearing, according to court transcripts, Michael expressed remorse for his actions and described feeling manipulated and used by his father. His attorney argued that Michael had been a young man following his father's instructions, that he had limited understanding of the consequences of what he was doing, and that his father bore primary responsibility for recruiting him into espionage. Arthur Walker was sentenced on November 12, 1985, receiving 3 life sentences plus 40 years. The judge recommended that he be eligible for parole after approximately 10 years. The relatively lighter sentence for Arthur compared to John and Whitworth reflected the limited scope of his involvement and his cooperation with investigators. Unlike John and Michael Walker, who eventually agreed to plead guilty, Jerry Whitworth contested the charges and went to trial. His trial began in March 1986 in U.S. District Court in San Francisco. The trial lasted approximately 10 weeks and included testimony from dozens of witnesses, including Navy communications experts, cryptographers, intelligence analysts, and FBI agents who had investigated the case. The prosecution presented extensive evidence of Whitworth's access to classified materials, his provision of those materials to Walker, the payments he had received, and the damage his espionage had caused to national security. The damage assessment prepared by the Department of Defense and presented during the trial indicated that the Walker spy ring had compromised virtually every aspect of U.S. Navy communications security over a period of at least 17 years. The cryptographic materials provided by members of the ring had allowed Soviet intelligence to decrypt millions of encrypted Navy communications, including information about ship movements, submarine operations, weapons systems, strategic planning, and command communications. Navy officials testified that the compromise was so extensive that the Soviets had potentially gained the ability to locate and track U.S. submarines, understand Navy tactical procedures, and anticipate U.S. military responses in crisis situations. One Navy cryptologist who testified stated that if war had broken out between the United States and the Soviet Union during the period when the Walker ring was operational, American casualties would likely have been significantly higher because Soviet forces would have had detailed knowledge of U.S. naval capabilities, positions, and intentions. Another witness, a rear admiral, described the compromise as the worst breach of naval security in the history of the United States Navy. On July 24, 1986, after deliberating for approximately 3 days, the jury found Jerry Whitworth guilty on all counts. On August 28, 1986, he was sentenced to 365 years in federal prison and fined $410,000. The sentence was effectively a life sentence, though structured to reflect the seriousness and multiplicity of his offenses. Barbara Walker was never charged with any crime, despite having known about her ex-husband's espionage since 1968. According to public statements from prosecutors, the decision not to charge Barbara was based on several factors. She had ultimately reported the espionage to authorities. Her failure to report earlier could be attributed to fear and coercion. She had not directly participated in any espionage activities, and prosecuting her would serve no significant public interest while punishing someone who had eventually done the right thing. However, Barbara's role in the case remained controversial. Some critics argued that her 16-year silence had allowed John Walker to continue compromising national security, to recruit additional members into his spy ring, and to endanger American military personnel. These critics suggested that Barbara had prioritized her own comfort and security over her obligations as a citizen. Others argued more sympathetically that Barbara had been a victim of domestic abuse and psychological manipulation, that she had lived in fear of her husband, and that she had eventually found the courage to come forward despite the personal cost. Barbara herself gave few interviews after the case became public. In one interview conducted in 1986 with a journalist, she described her years of silence as the worst mistake of her life and acknowledged that she had allowed fear and denial to override her judgment. According to her own statements in that interview, she expressed guilt about not having reported John's espionage in 1968. Saying that if she had acted then, perhaps he would not have recruited their children, perhaps the damage to national security would have been less severe, and perhaps she would not have spent 16 years carrying an unbearable secret. The impact on the Walker children was profound and lasting. Michael, incarcerated at age 23, would serve approximately 15 years of his 25-year sentence before being released on parole in 2000. He was 38 years old at release, having spent most of his 20s and 30s in federal prison. According to later accounts and interviews, Michael struggled significantly with reintegrating into society, finding employment, and establishing relationships. He expressed ongoing anger toward his father for having recruited him into espionage and for having destroyed his life. Laura, Cynthia, and Margaret Walker, the three daughters who were not involved in the espionage ring, also faced significant challenges. They had to cope with the public shame of their father's treason, the imprisonment of their father and brother, their mother's alcoholism and long silence, and their own complicated feelings about family loyalty, betrayal, and identity. According to accounts from family friends, all three daughters maintained minimal contact with their parents in the years following the arrests and struggled to build lives separate from the notoriety of being John Walker's daughters. John Walker served his life sentence at multiple federal prisons. He was initially incarcerated at the maximum security United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, and was later transferred to other facilities. According to accounts from prison officials and from journalists who interviewed him, Walker adapted reasonably well to prison life. He worked in prison jobs, maintained correspondence with some family members, and gave several interviews to journalists and researchers over the years. In these interviews, according to published accounts, Walker showed limited remorse, either for his espionage or for the impact on his family. He acknowledged that he had broken the law and deserved punishment, but maintained that the damage had been exaggerated by prosecutors and Navy officials. He claimed the cryptographic materials would only have been useful to the Soviets for limited periods before encryption systems changed, and suggested his espionage had not actually endangered American lives. Claims disputed by intelligence officials who maintained the compromise had been catastrophic. He acknowledged that recruiting Michael had been a mistake, but suggested Michael had been a willing participant who understood what he was doing. He expressed no apparent guilt about having put his ex-wife in an impossible position, about having recruited his brother, or about the destruction of his family. Jerry Whitworth served his sentence at various federal prisons. He maintained his innocence for several years after his conviction, claiming that he had not understood that the materials he was providing to Walker would be passed to Soviet intelligence. This claim was not credible, given the evidence presented at trial, and eventually, according to prison records. Whitworth acknowledged his guilt. He applied for parole multiple times and was denied each time. He died in federal prison in 2021 at the age of 82, having served approximately 35 years. Arthur Walker was released on parole in 1994 after serving approximately 9 years of his sentence. He was in his early 60s at release, in poor health, and financially destitute. According to accounts from those who knew him, he worked various low-wage jobs, maintained minimal contact with family members, and largely lived in obscurity. He died in 2014 at the age of 80. Michael Walker was released on parole in 2000 at age 38. He attempted to build a normal life, finding work in various trades and maintaining a low profile. According to interviews he gave to journalists in later years, Michael was bitter about his father's role in his incarceration and maintained no relationship with John. He emphasized that he had been young and naive when his father recruited him, and that he had not fully understood the implications of what he was doing. Barbara Walker lived the remainder of her life in Massachusetts, working sporadically and struggling with alcoholism. She gave a small number of interviews in the late 1980s, but generally avoided publicity. Barbara died in 2009 at the age of 72, her guilt never fully resolved. John Anthony Walker, Jr. died on August 28, 2014, at the age of 77, while incarcerated at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. He had served approximately 29 years of his life sentence, having been denied parole on multiple occasions. His obituary in major newspapers focused almost entirely on his espionage activities, describing him as one of the most damaging spies in American history. There was minimal mention of his life before espionage, his family, or any aspects of his character beyond his betrayal. The Walker spy ring case led to significant changes in how the U.S. Navy and other military services handled personnel security and communications security. Enhanced background check procedures were implemented, more frequent security reviews were mandated for personnel with access to sensitive materials, and cryptographic systems were redesigned to limit the damage that could be caused by a single person's compromise. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of family members to recruitment by intelligence services and led to greater attention to potential indicators that someone might be engaged in espionage. The question of what motivated Barbara Walker to finally report her ex-husband after years of silence is complex and has been the subject of considerable analysis. According to her own statements in interviews, several factors played a role. She described her increasing suspicion that John had recruited their son Michael as a wake-up call that made her realize her silence was not protecting anyone, but was instead enabling John to endanger their children. She described years of guilt and fear that had become psychologically unbearable. She described feeling that she had no choice but to finally do what she should have done 16 years earlier. What is clear from the documented record is that Barbara Walker's decision to report her ex-husband came at significant personal cost. She received no financial compensation for her information. She faced public scrutiny and criticism for her years of silence. Her relationship with her children was complicated by her role in their father and brother's imprisonment. Her alcoholism worsened rather than improved after the case became public. The Walker spy ring case raises profound questions about loyalty, betrayal, family obligation, and moral responsibility. John Walker betrayed his country for money and psychological satisfaction. He recruited his brother, his son, and endangered his entire family, prioritizing his own interests over their welfare. Barbara Walker kept her husband's secrets for 16 years, prioritizing family stability and her own security over her obligations to report espionage. Michael Walker followed his father's lead, demonstrating loyalty to family, even when that loyalty meant betraying his country. Arthur Walker and Jerry Whitworth each made choices to commit espionage for various combinations of financial, personal, and psychological reasons. Each of these individuals faced choices, and each made decisions that had consequences extending far beyond what they anticipated or understood at the time. John Walker thought he could compartmentalize his espionage from his family life, maintaining both indefinitely without one affecting the other. He was wrong. Barbara Walker thought she could keep her husband's secret without becoming complicit in his crimes. She was wrong. Michael Walker thought he could trust his father to protect him even while involving him in espionage. He was wrong. Beyond the documented damage assessments, the human cost of the case extended across decades and generations. That human cost includes Michael Walker spending 15 years in federal prison during what should have been the prime of his life. It includes the Walker daughters growing up with the stigma of having a traitor as a father and struggling to build identities separate from that legacy. It includes Barbara Walker's death at 72, her alcoholism never overcome. It includes Arthur Walker dying alone and largely forgotten, having spent 9 years in prison for following his brother into espionage. The human cost also includes the thousands of Navy personnel whose lives were potentially endangered by the compromise of communications security. When naval officers testified that American casualties in the event of war would likely have been higher because of the Walker ring's espionage, they were describing real people, sailors and officers whose safety depended on the security of military communications and who were unknowingly endangered by the betrayal of their colleagues. The larger question raised by the Walker case is how to think about responsibility in situations where multiple people make choices that contribute to harmful outcomes. John Walker bears primary responsibility for initiating the espionage, for recruiting others, and for the years of compromise. But Barbara Walker's 16-year silence enabled that espionage to continue and expand. Michael Walker's participation, even if coerced by family loyalty and youth, directly contributed to the compromise. Arthur Walker and Jerry Whitworth each chose to participate for their own reasons. Soviet intelligence officers recruited, handled, and exploited these assets, prioritizing intelligence collection over any concern for the harm they were causing or the people whose lives they were destroying. To focus exclusively on individual responsibility is to miss the systemic factors that created opportunities and incentives for espionage. The Cold War environment encouraged ideological polarization, treated classified information as currency in a global competition, and created massive quantities of classified materials that were difficult to secure. The Navy's personnel security systems granted access to sensitive materials to thousands of people while relying on imperfect background checks and sporadic monitoring. Family dynamics created relationships of trust and obligation that could be exploited for recruitment. But to focus exclusively on systems is to deny individual agency and to absolve people of responsibility for choices they made. John Walker chose to approach the Soviet embassy and offer to sell secrets. Barbara Walker chose to remain silent for 16 years. Michael Walker chose to provide classified materials to his father. These were human choices made by individuals with the capacity to choose differently. The Walker case forces consideration of how ordinary people, facing ordinary pressures and temptations, can make choices that cause extraordinary harm. John Walker was not particularly ideological. He was primarily motivated by money and ego. Barbara Walker was not particularly cowardly. She was frightened and overwhelmed. Michael Walker was not particularly traitorous. He was a son following his father's lead. Yet together, their choices resulted in one of the worst security breaches in American naval history. Barbara Walker's phone call to the FBI on November 19, 1984, represented the moment when 16 years of silence ended and when the consequences that had been building for nearly 2 decades began to unfold. That phone call, made by an alcoholic ex-wife who had kept her husband's secrets since 1968, initiated an investigation that dismantled one of the most damaging espionage operations in American history. It led to the arrest and imprisonment of 4 men, the exposure of a massive security breach, and the destruction of whatever remained of the Walker family. John Anthony Walker, Jr. was 47 years old when he was arrested in May 1985. He was 77 when he died in prison in 2014, having served nearly 3 decades of a life sentence. During those years, he lost his freedom, his family relationships, his place in society, and ultimately his life. He had spent 18 years committing espionage, believing he could maintain the operation indefinitely without consequences, believing he could manage the risks and compartmentalize the different aspects of his life. Barbara's phone call represented the moment when his carefully constructed compartments collapsed, when his secrets became evidence, when his past caught up with his present. Barbara Walker was 47 years old when she made the phone call to the FBI that initiated the investigation. She was 72 when she died in 2009, having spent the final 25 years of her life dealing with the aftermath of that call and the 16 years of silence that preceded it. She had made 2 decisions: the decision to keep her husband's secrets in 1968 and the decision to report him in 1984, and both decisions had been simultaneously acts of protection and acts of betrayal, depending on which values and obligations one prioritizes. Michael Walker was 23 years old when he was arrested. He was 38 when he was released from prison. He lost 15 years when he might have been building a career, forming relationships, starting a family, living a normal life. Instead, he served time in federal prison for crimes his father had recruited him into, paying the price for both his own choices and for following his father's lead. The Walker spy ring case remains one of the most studied espionage cases in American history, analyzed for its operational details, its security implications, and its human dimensions. But perhaps the most important lesson from the case is the simplest. Secrets have weight, betrayals have consequences, and those consequences ripple outward in ways that touch everyone connected to the person who made the original choice to betray. Barbara Walker's phone call on November 19, 1984, was just a voice on a telephone line to an FBI agent who had heard similar calls before. But that call carried the weight of 16 years of silence, 18 years of espionage, and decisions that would echo through decades and through generations, destroying lives and leaving questions that can never be fully answered about responsibility, loyalty, family, and the impossible choices people face when trying to protect both their country and the people they love.